Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Open Source and Open Standards, Navigating the Intricacies of a Symbiotic Partnership, presented by CTO Universe and sponsored by Instaclustr. I'm Rebecca, the webinar coordinator of CTO Universe, and I'm excited to bring you this fresh session with hard-earned insight about how we can make open source and open standards even more effective by helping them recapture their strong partnership. I'm really looking forward today to talking to Guy Martin and what will be an interesting and amusing conversation. We are recording this webinar in case you have to leave early at any point. We are putting the link to the series page right now in the chat box. Up next, and before we go any further, I want to thank Instaclustr for sponsoring this exclusive webinar and helping us make this happen. Instaclustr delivers reliability at scale through their integrated data platform of open source technologies such as Apache Cassandra, Apache Kafka, Apache Spark, Elasticsearch, and Redis. Their expertise stems from delivering more than 70 million node hours under management, allowing them to run the world's most powerful data technologies effortlessly. They provide a range of managed consulting and support services that help their customers develop and deploy solutions around open source technologies. Through their integrated data platform built on open source technologies, they power mission-critical, highly available applications for their customers and help them achieve scalability, reliability, and performance through their applications. To learn more, go ahead and visit instaclustr.com. So thanks again, Instaclustr, for helping us make this happen. Up next, and before we go any further, I want to get some technical things out of the way. Please feel free to ask questions during today's session. You can do so by submitting them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can towards the end of the presentation with a Q&A. Good questions always contribute to a great webinar, so please don't be shy. Guy is here to help you every step of the way. My lovely colleague David will be fielding your questions today. He'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, so pull up the questions panel and say hello to let him know that you're listening. Lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may wish to choose to dial in by phone. You can do so by selecting the More button on the upper right portion of your screen and then select the Switch to Phone option. Up next, and what we're all here for, today I am talking to Guy Martin. Guy Martin is the Executive Director of OASIS Open, an internationally recognized standards development and open source project consortium. He works closely with the OASIS staff and the open source community to help integrate the best open source and open standards into a powerful collaborative force for innovation. Guy has a unique blend of 25 plus years of experience as both a software engineer and an open source strategist. So go, 1-2 punch. He has built open source programs for companies like Red Hat, Samsung, and Autodesk, and was instrumental in founding the Academy Software Foundation while director of the open source office at Autodesk. He was also the founding member of the team that built the Open Connectivity Foundation while at Samsung, helping successfully integrate in standards with open source software implementations. So you are all going to be in fantastic hands today. Without any further ado, take it away, Guy.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much, Rebecca. And I wanted to say welcome to everybody and greetings from the Pacific Northwest. I'm here at my home office outside of Portland, Oregon. And I'm excited to share with you today a topic that really is a professional passion of mine, finding a way to navigate and improve the relationship between open source and open standards communities. It's the primary reason I took this role as executive director at OASIS Open about a year ago now, because I think that the combination of these two communities is going to be critical not only to technology today, but to all of us worldwide as we go forward. So with that, I'd like to cover a little bit just at the top about who OASIS Open is. Some of you may have heard of us, and some of you may not have. So here's kind of a quick overview. And I think this also will give you some perspective for things I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So we're the home to many standards that you may be familiar with, such as SAML, UBL, AMQP, MQTT, and some others. But we also are home to a standard you may use and not realize, which is the Common Alerting Protocol, which is if you've ever gotten an Amber Alert or a weather alert, that is delivered through the Common Alerting Protocol, which is implemented and used by governments and others worldwide. And many of the standards that we have today have gone on to receive de jure approval through other international standards bodies, and we'll give a little bit more color to that later in the presentation. The thing I really liked about OASIS when I was researching coming to this role is that we have a broad technical agenda. We cover everything from cybersecurity, blockchain, privacy, the sharing economy, cryptography in general, cloud computing, emergency management, and the list goes on and on. And we're fortunate to have membership in OASIS across public, private, academic sectors, and across a wide variety of industries. So with that, let's get started. So why open source and open standards? I think what I want to do in this section is really kind of set the stage for us all as to why open source, the combination of open source and open standards is so important. And I think that it's really the key to what I see as moving us forward as an industry, especially in the light of COVID and what has happened. So I apologize, as I've mentioned, Rebecca. Unfortunately, there's work going on outside. We're all in a webinar and digital environment, so apologies in advance for the chainsaw situation. But moving forward, let's talk about 2020. It was a tough year for all of us, and I know it's incredibly important for us to acknowledge that. But because of that, I'd like to start today by sharing this challenging example, which I think really illustrates the importance of open source and open standards. And it's probably not an example you'd likely think of when you're thinking about technology or software. In 2020 alone, the Western US, and this is primarily those of us here in Oregon, California, and Colorado, experienced almost 8,500 wildland fires, which burned about 5 million acres, 9,500 homes lost, and 41 lives as of this presentation that were unfortunately lost. And clearly these are some grim statistics. But in the face of this tremendous tragedy, I think there are some great examples of incredible resilience, determination, and the great use of technology and standards. So before I moved to Oregon 3 years ago, I was very fortunate. I had the honor to serve the citizens of California for 10 years as a CAL FIRE volunteer. CAL FIRE is the all-risk fire agency for the state of California. And in that time, I helped build out our volunteer communication staff, and we did a lot of different things, but we were primarily responsible for running the communications command post vehicles at wildland fire incidents. And if you think about this, fire agencies, and you've probably seen it on the news, come and band together to fight these fires. Multiple agencies from different jurisdictions show up at one incident. And we were very lucky that we were able to rely on a standard, the APCO P25 digital radio standard, which let us communicate efficiently, providing life safety and critical information that allowed the firefighters to do their jobs, which is obviously protecting life and property. However, as all these different fire agencies came together, often they brought radios from different manufacturers, which presented an issue when those of us on the command post and the radio side had to reprogram large sets of radio frequencies so that they could talk to each other using this P25 standard. And because there was no standard for actually writing radio data to these different radios, other than the base level serial communications protocol, each manufacturer had written their own proprietary software, which really slowed the process of programming and cloning these radios. Because we had to keep multiple copies of software on different laptops and figure out which radios we were going to program at which time. And so if all these manufacturers had instead contributed to an open source implementation conforming to a standard, that could have provided a very, very critical tool, and it would have shared the cost of developing such software where they can compete on features in the radios, but how you program the actual frequencies is really not a differentiating feature. In short, there really wasn't a competitive advantage to be gained from proprietary radio programming software, and a lot of things to gain on the user side by standardizing on this. So I think the benefit here of coherent standards and corresponding open source implementations is not unique to safety critical situations like wildland fires. I think there are many areas of our lives that could significantly benefit from a better integration of open source and open standards. So let's get some definitions out of the way because I want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. And apologies because some of you probably know at least part of these, but I wanted to kind of cover it so that we make sure we're all starting from the same place. So I'm sure everybody here has heard of open source software because you're on this podcast, but open source software is not just software that is approved or is distributed under one of the main licenses approved by the OSI or the Open Source Initiative. It's not just that licensing regime. It's also what I would consider an industry accepted practice that open source also refers to the community of individuals. And some of these are corporate paid, but also some of them are freelancers who develop the software in an open and collaborative manner. So the community, and I'll talk more about the community later, the community is actually one of the really, really important things about open source software, not just the licensing that it's released under. On the open standards side, open standards are really agreed upon definitions of functionality for many things. So it could be hardware, an example I use radios, it could be general practices, but in this case, we're going to talk about it in the context of software. So our friends at the OSI, again, are a great resource here because they have developed something called the Open Standards Requirements, or OSR, which I've given you a link here to, which sets out the definition of what an open standard is. The primary requirement of that being that an open standard is freely available under license and royalty terms that allow easy and unencumbered implementation rights to anyone. And if you further break down the standards piece a bit, we have both de facto and de jure standards. And you heard me mention de jure standards at the top of the presentation. De facto standards are usually, but not always, proprietary packages. So Microsoft Office, for example, that have grown through really widespread usage to be the standard tool set for many users. Contrast that with de jure standards or by law standards, which are built and approved by recognized standardization bodies such as OASIS or ISO, ITU, IETF, a variety of other standards bodies. And they're developed with broad collaboration among many of the participants. And for the most part, not always, these are generally open standards that ensure interoperability between products from many vendors. Okay, so definitions out of the way. Let's go what I like to call back to the future. So where do we start in an understanding of why open source and open standards matter to us in the technology space? And I really think we need to look no further than the very beginnings of the internet. So the picture there on the top right is an interface message processor, or IMP. Basically the first packet switching devices which were on the ARPANET, or the predecessor to the internet, did not use TCP/IP, but did rely on common shared software that predated TCP/IP. But I think the important thing here is it relied on shared software and shared standards to begin to build what became the internet. And as the ARPANET morphed into what we know as the internet, this is the bedrock of what we are relying on right now to have this conversation. You had standards and open source implementations combining together to bring us TCP/IP, HTTP, SAML, which we host at OASIS, Network Time Protocol, XML, JSON, and many others. We literally could not be having this virtual webinar without the seamless integration of open source with open standards. And I really firmly believe that we need to recapture the spirit of cooperation that between standards and open source that really was the bedrock and the foundation of the internet. So let's face it, if you still don't believe that the convergence of open source and open standards is important, can you imagine today's world that we're living in right now without the internet? In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, the internet, virtual communications have literally become our window on the world. And some of those of us who were accustomed to commuting, our homes have now become our offices. Some would say that's a good thing or a bad thing. And most of us were used to shopping online, but now we're also shopping for groceries and having them delivered and using Amazon, as well as the majority of us have, even now in pandemic times, cut the cord, and we have the convenience of streaming entertainment services to kind of keep some of our sanity. We're visiting our doctors virtually, and our children are attending school virtually. And as someone with two 10-year-olds, we're thankful they're going back to school, but at least they had the option, and we had the option to continue working with them in this virtual environment. In short, the internet's impact on our daily lives really has never been more profound. So let's talk about emergency response. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it crystal clear that we actually need to continue to invest in both open source and open standards and their combination. There's been great work already going on here at OASIS in these areas, especially in the emergency management technical committee that we have. And I mentioned common alerting protocol earlier, but there's also hospital availability and other related standards. There's standards like the AS4 standard in Europe that is being used to help build these COVID-19 data exchanges so we can get a handle on where the disease has progressed and other things that are needed to actually help combat this. The problem is that even these great standards that we have at OASIS and others that are hosted elsewhere need good open source implementations. I know, for example, the common alerting protocol, there's been a lot of conversation we've been having around the fact that there's kind of these different implementations which all conform to the CAP standard, but it's very difficult sometimes for governments to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this? Whereas being able to have an open source implementation and then build additional functionality on top of that from a vendor standpoint actually would help governments out, very similar to the example I used around radios. And this is an area where public and government and private partnerships have traditionally not been as strong. And I think it's really important that we make this happen going forward, because I think we learned a great many lessons overall as a society in this pandemic. Being better prepared, both from a mitigation standpoint and technology, as well as looking for new opportunities to help streamline things like vaccination rollout, because we all know that that has been a huge challenge, right? Vaccination rollout. And I'm not saying technology is the full solution to this, but I think we haven't really explored what we could be doing to do a better job of making sure we've got that critical infrastructure in place when we need it before we get to the next major worldwide medical or disaster event. And from a security standpoint, another important aspect of where we're going in standards and open source cooperation is in the security space. We've become reliant, obviously, on technology. We just said that for everything in our lives. And as that has happened, the security threat surface has really increased exponentially. And we seemingly hear almost daily about hacking and incursions into critical government systems like SolarWinds, but also things that happen in the energy grid and other critical infrastructure, which has got a combination of hardware and software. And there's really a lot of things to work on here. But open source and open standards, I think, play a critical role in things like SBOM or software bill of materials, figuring out what is in the software. And this has been a staple of the open source world, of being able to understand from a compliance standpoint what open source packages are in your software. But I think we need to extend that to what are things in proprietary software, what packages are part of this. So it's not a silver bullet for things like SolarWinds, but it would definitely help get governments especially to understand what is in the things that they purchase. There's also really important work going on. Again, this happens to be at OASIS, but there's other work going on in other places as well, like SPDX with our friends at the Linux Foundation. But we have things like OCA, the Open Cybersecurity Alliance, which is really about sharing threat and vulnerability data through STIX, the Structured Threat Information Expression Language, and TAXII, the Trusted Automated Exchange of Intelligence Information. This is really about finding ways to let vendors still provide value on top of their proprietary products, but share data more effectively with other systems and other vendors who end users and consumers are using those products. It's really about finding a way to make that streamlined so that the end user has the best of all information provided by these vendors. And there are really many large and small organizations that are trying to tackle the problem of cybersecurity. So finding, again, a way to use consistent processes to ensure the interoperability and validation of this threat data is going to be a challenge, I think, going forward, both for open source and open standards communities. And we need to come to better agreement on making sure that we have a way to provide the greatest value to the end users of all of the cyber security threat data that's out there. So hopefully at this point, I've made the case that there is really a genuine need for open source and open standards communities to be better aligned for everything that we're doing in tech. But now let's talk a little bit about maybe where the rubber meets the road, or how do we find common ground? And these communities are not only very different at times, they come with different perspectives on how to solve a lot of the same problems. And I was afraid slides would slide. Go forward. So here we are, coming together. I think rather than view open source and open standards as adversaries, let's talk a little bit about how they can come together to deliver better outcomes. And I think if you consider the historical background, you'll see that standards, well, primarily came to light through legal departments after having some patentable or valuable intellectual property that bubbled up to them from products and engineering. And open source activities, for the most part, didn't make that same journey. The IP around those was initially probably deemed less important than the outcome. But as I got further into my role here at OASIS, what I realized is that in talking to both communities and also in my experience with Open Connectivity Foundation, having built a standard and an open source reference implementation in that community, what I realized is that the outcomes of both the open standards and open source communities are really the same. Comes down to interoperability, choice, and innovation. Where these communities differ is in how they approach getting to those outcomes. And despite the differences that are there, they do have commonality in what they're concerned about. They're concerned about what the governance looks like, what the use cases look like, and how they approach consensus. So in practice, what I found is that fast open standards groups, and I know that may seem like an oxymoron to anybody who's dealt with standards, but yes, fast open standards groups do exist, usually work well with very solid open source projects. And as a matter of fact, one of the goals that we have for our open projects program here at OASIS, which I'll kind of give you a little bit more detail about later, one of the goals we have there is to help bring together these kinds of communities because we believe there's tremendous value in both approaches, including for technology creators, but more importantly for technology consumers. Specs tend to outlive code. The saying, W3C has a saying that the words tend to outlive the code. And as specs tend to outlive this code, we'll need more agreement to ensure interoperability, both from previous and future versions. And this often helps drive standards from a functionality and edge case definition standpoint. In many discussions that I've had with both open source and open standards communities, it's become pretty clear to me that helping to define what I call an open development ecosystem is critical. Technologies today, we know, are more interdependent than ever, and de facto standards, whether they're open source projects or proprietary packages, don't always give buyers the confidence that the technology that they're using is going to be interoperable either now or in the future. And the trade-off for modularity here is perhaps a lack of wide interoperability, which can drive up short and long-term development costs. And also interoperability without modularity is just lock-in, right? A converged open development ecosystem gives more choice to everyone in the ecosystem. One of the other big challenges, which we saw earlier in the coming together slide, is finding a way to bridge the intellectual property gap. So bringing a balance of protecting the differentiated IP that vendors have not only a right but a desire to have, while allowing and encouraging being supportive of non-differentiated IP in standards and code. So being able to freely give to important technology efforts, be they source code or specifications. And one of the ways this happens is, and I'll use the example in a little bit of our baseline initiative at OASIS, is using your API, your major API interfaces as the bones for starting that specification work. This is usually a great place to begin in trying to find a way to provide a convergence between these two communities. And finally, finding good neutral guidance with all of the potential roadblocks in combining these communities is important. And this is the critical role of open source and open standards foundations and consortiums like OASIS and others. And so I have a section here in a few minutes that kind of goes into more details about some of these things with regard to foundations and consortiums. So I think part of the goal of educating, and I think it's important to educate both the open standards and the open source communities, it's important to consider that there are some hidden gems of collaboration that have already happened, not only obviously the examples I used kind of at the beginning of the internet, but even in our modern day era, there are a lot of examples of collaboration that have already happened with open source and open standards. I think I like to say that really code and standards have never really actually been strangers. So if you look at the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the IETF, they've been building networking standards based on this notion of rough consensus and running code for quite a while. And I already mentioned that our colleagues at the OSI have created the open standards requirements, so they've been part of this collaborative work as well. Here at OASIS, even before we did our open projects initiative, many of our existing traditional standards groups would create open repositories on GitHub, or, given the age of us as an organization, SourceForge. For those that remember SourceForge way back before GitHub, standards groups would create repositories to provide sample code and implementation of critical parts of the standard. So another area that I know we at OASIS and some of our sister foundations have also tried to do is helping raise the bar on open standards. So when I decided to take this role at OASIS, a lot of folks in my open source community seemed a little bit perturbed by that and said, this is a strange career choice for you, Guy, because I've been involved in open source for a long time. They said, well, you're going to go to a place like OASIS, which has, RAND-based standards, which require royalties to be paid. But in getting here, only 0.4% of our standards that we've issued over 25 years here at OASIS require royalties to be paid. And so I think having royalty-free, unlimited, or basically non-assert type of standards is critical to breaking down the barriers between getting specifications out and getting implementations of those specifications. The synergies between open source and open standards, I think, happen in one of three ways. Sometimes the standard comes first, as in the case of UBL, which is a standard for electronic invoicing that's been pretty widely adopted in Europe. It generated a lot of local profiles in Europe, regional public projects, and open source tools. Sometimes the code comes first. So example of that some of you may be familiar with is the Star Office, right? The Star Office started building software which enabled other royalty-free Office document, spreadsheet, and presentation software to pop up. And this later became the open document format hosted here at OASIS, which went on to become an internationally recognized standard with ISO. And sometimes these communities and efforts form in parallel. So I gave the example earlier of the OCF, or Open Connectivity Framework, but also standards like Messaging Queue Telemetry Transport, or MQTT, which standardized a lightweight kind of IoT sensor and device coordination protocol, started along with a project at the Eclipse Foundation called PAHO. And the two of these things then ended up feeding each other improvements, which made the overall project stronger, both from the standard side and the open source side. So I think one of the things that we need to think about in terms of finding common ground is finding balance. So my colleague Simon Phipps from the open source initiative OSI wrote a couple of really great blog posts recently comparing the coexistence of open source and open standards work to growing blueberries in his garden. And I wasn't aware of this because I'm not a gardener, but apparently blueberries are extremely fickle. And so having just the right conditions, soil, pH balance, water, et cetera, is really, really important. But he wanted to also have a place in his garden for other, what he called more unruly plants. Now, he kind of compared open source communities to being unruly. I don't know if I'd go that far, but they definitely, as we saw in the coming together slide, have a little bit different view sometimes on governance than standards do. But again, finding the balance here is really important. And I would argue that it's generally easier at a neutral body like a consortium or foundation to find that balance. A key element of this governance process is one that allows to have, maybe more rigid standards definition to allow that to work, as well as give some guardrails to kind of the more rambunctious open source projects. And I'm not going to belabor the challenges that come with licensing and intellectual property. It's pretty clear that there's some very different views on that. But there's also a clear need for both businesses and participants in these technology projects to come to a common understanding on what a compatible licensing regime looks like for both the words, the standard, and the code, open source. And usually this tends to get mired down around things like patents. And so having, for example, non-assert or royalty-free on the standard side, and potentially something like Apache, which has the implicit patent grant on the open source side, maybe tends to make this work a little bit better. Whoop. Slides keep moving the wrong direction. There we go. So another thing in terms of finding common ground, I think, is understanding that there's a different culture and pace to these two communities. Where things tend to break down is in the fact that both of these communities have very different approaches to the notions of culture and pace. And I think there's some things we can consider in an attempt to bridge the differences. So one of the first things is determine how nimble your standards definition has to be. And I mentioned earlier that yes, there are actually fast standards organization, or fast by their standards, probably not as fast as those in the open source world would consider to be quick. But does the standard you're building have to have a traditional standards development process where all the possible use cases are mapped out from the beginning? Or can it be a little bit more nimble and iterative, which allows for naturally occurring changes that are driven by outside factors like an open source implementation? So I remember distinctly when we were starting the Open Connectivity Foundation, Samsung and Intel project, that was one of the things that we really had to address from the beginning is which sometimes the standard would be the leading edge, sometimes the open source implementation would be the leading edge. But on the standard side, we adopted a process and a method where we did try to map out as many use cases and edge cases as we could from the beginning, but we also were open to the open source project, implementing things that weren't quite in the standard yet, and that there was a natural synergy that drove what went into the standard. And then if we needed a clarification on something that was implemented in the open source world, it would also come from the standard side. So there was a good back and forth there. You also need to think about how much overt and strong governance should be on the open source project. And by this, I want to be really clear. I don't necessarily mean licensing. It's more thinking about, are there enough strong companies or personalities in the open source project that you need to have a lot more explicit rules of the road in terms of what the contribution guidelines look like? Or if there aren't those kind of strong personalities and companies from the beginning, maybe it's okay to start small and evolve the contribution rules for the open source project as you go along. And the third piece of this, which I think is really, really important, and again, it's one of the things that I appreciated most about the work we did with the Open Connectivity Foundation, is we had to find regular checkpoints where both groups could come together to discuss the latest state of the efforts, be it on the standard side or on the open source side. And what this allowed us to do was find commonalities, and more importantly, find differences that were happening that were likely to impact the other side. So instead of having people just kind of go off into their own camps, there was that work that was happening, but we had regular checkpoints where we were able to come together and figure out, okay, what things do we need to work on, or what roadblocks do we potentially have going on in this work. Oop, way back. These slides are just getting crazy today. So with all of that, as promised, I think it's now important to kind of dive into a little bit deeper what I consider the value of foundations and consortiums and what they can bring to, kind of the challenges and issues we've discussed up to this point. And as I was putting this together, I wanted this to be topics of a general nature with some pieces of how we do this at OASIS, because I was very cognizant that all of you don't want to hear an OASIS sales pitch. You want to hear kind of the thoughts that I've had over my career in terms of how this works generally in all kinds of foundations. But I think the approach that we've taken out at OASIS has been one of the things that's kind of helped me formulate some of the things that I've been thinking about in the last year on this. So let's get started with some general areas where I think foundations and consortiums can provide value to both open source and open standards communities. Come on, slides. There we go. So the first thing is, I think, that's most important, and it's the number one reason I have heard given by both communities, the standards and open source communities, when it comes to why they brought their work to a foundation, is neutrality. And really, I think this is kind of one of the key elements. So in order to get really widespread collaboration and ultimately adoption of your open source or open standards, the work needs to be located in a place that doesn't have a vested corporate interest in making a profit based on that work. Now, when I say that, I want to be really, really clear. Building value on top of the open source or open standards it's not only okay, it's really incredibly valuable. But providing a space where partners and even competitors come to work together on the common foundational pieces underneath that value add, that's really important. And a foundation is a great place to do that. I look at neutrality this way, and I typically think it has two dimensions. Neutrality of governance and process. So really a common and agreed upon set of rules of the road for what collaboration looks like, what the contribution model looks like, how people get the ability to start making decisions in this open standard or open project. And also neutrality of influence and direction. And while most work done at foundations is naturally led by the companies that come in as the initial project sponsors, one of the reasons you come to a foundation is because you definitely want to make sure that other people feel like it's not just company A or company B doing all the work and therefore setting all of the direction, that there's a balance and neutrality to the way that decisions are handled, especially about finance and project direction. So fairness is a really, really important piece of it too. So in addition to neutrality, I think it's really important that foundations and consortiums provide fairness, because if anybody who's ever worked in an engineering team or in a standard knows that there's obviously going to be cases of disagreement, and that can happen either within the open source or open standards community itself or between these two communities. The main ways that this balance of fairness occurs are really consistent and transparent oversight of whatever the neutral process rules and processes were that were put together that are kind of at the core of what the foundation's value proposition is. And more importantly, I think consistent and open enforcement, not only of the process rules that I just described, but also things that are maybe a little less obvious, like the community covenant, or more often these days, the codes of conduct. So, being it's a little pedantic to say this sometimes, maybe sometimes you have to be the adult in the room. And I think foundations have a way of being able to provide that make it easier for these things to move forward, and for corporations to feel like, okay, and contributors to feel like there's fairness in the way these things are applied. And I think both of these things require unique skill sets and talents that are really generally wielded by a group of individuals in foundations who I would classify kind of as community managers or community shepherds. So I think it's really important to discuss a little bit more about what that kind of a role entails. So as somebody who grew up kind of in the community management space after I finished my engineering career, I love this picture because it really does describe the life of a community manager. And community is sometimes an overloaded, or people would think of it as a squishy term. It's soft skills, is there anything really concrete to it? But I think strong community shepherding is critical to moving open source and open standards activities forward. Building communities, because I've done this, so I understand that building communities is really difficult at times, but I liken it to kind of a systems level view of engineering. So you have to understand not just your own system, but you have to understand a multitude of variables and the way the entire system interacts together. And whether this is mitigating disagreements about what goes into a spec, or helping smooth over challenges in what functionality is going to be accepted into an open source project, community professionals and foundations, I think, do much of the heavy lifting to keep this work moving forward. And as you can imagine, finding these people with kind of big picture thinking skills, some technical ability, ability to communicate between open source and open standards groups is definitely a challenge. And I think this role, kind of akin to what the picture shows there, this role is part project management, it's part psychology, it's part traffic cop, it's part outreach and advocacy. So, really finding someone or someone's multiple that are good at this is really, really critical to the success, I think, of open source, open standards projects. My experience, though, is that almost every successful foundation that I've been a part of, and OASIS is no exception, has one or more of these resources that help identify the right people to participate in the communities, whether it's open source or open standards, and increasingly how to get the common intersection between these kinds of two projects together. And I'm very thankful that at OASIS we have two great resources to do this, one on our standard side and one on our open source project side. So kind of with that, I'd like to give you a little bit of flavor about how we approach this here at OASIS, because I think it kind of speaks to some of these things. So the OASIS Open Projects effort really is about developing that code, APIs, standards, kind of reference implementations in a common place with open source licenses, and as we talked about earlier, with a path to this international policy and procurement recognition. And the program is actually a little more than 2 years old. It started before I was hired at OASIS, and it's actually one of the reasons I wanted to come here, is seeing what the organization did to kind of use their existing great reputation and the work they've done on the traditional standard side and bring in open source and sort of begin to combine these two things together. Today, we've got a lot of activity in blockchain and cybersecurity. I mentioned the baseline project earlier. It's one of the things that we're most happy about here at OASIS, because it allows you to actually, in a blockchain agnostic way, provide a means to verify private transactions that happen in private blockchains on the public Ethereum mainnet without divulging any private data. So it has some very interesting pieces to it. So what does this look like kind of from a process standpoint? One of the main things I think we're able to offer is what I consider a consistent process for both the traditional standards work we've always done, as well as our open source work. As you can see, open source projects here can produce project specifications kind of similar to what our traditional technical committee specs look like. But after that, they both enter either the technical committee spec or the open project spec, enter our normal OASIS standardization track, which can lead to being an OASIS recognized standard, as well as the ability to submit this through our partnerships with international standards bodies like ISO, ITU, ANSI, et cetera. And some people have asked me, well, why is it important to potentially do that? You look at something like open document format. So I think getting this international recognition not only helps ensure that interoperability is maintained with multiple current or future implementations. We have found that in my experience being a contractor consultant with the U.S. Department of Defense, kind of gave me the experience around highly regulated procurement pipelines and how those pure procurement pipelines were a lot of times more biased to standards than they were to open source. So having something that is a standard can actually help you get open source into these highly regulated procurement pipelines. And I mentioned our first open source, one of our first open projects, the baseline project, and described to you what it did. But the thing I love is that they did what I mentioned earlier in my presentation, which is that they took their API definition and they really used that as the bones or the scaffolding of their specification, their open project specification, which they're now in the process of finalizing with the hope that it continues to go on in this path to OASIS standard and eventually international standard. So what's our approach? I think really our approach can be best specified as make open source and standardization better together. And as I mentioned on the standard side, they've kind of been doing this since about 2004. The Open Projects Initiative is only a couple of years old, but there's been a lot of work that's been done in terms of just making open repositories available for the standards that OASIS has had. But we've heard loud and clear from our members that they want this hybrid approach of being both a standards organization and an open source hosting organization that merges the best of those two things together. They want these specs and these implementations to be used in the greater world. So, our technical committees can have multiple open source repositories, and our open source projects can also have specification repositories that they use for documenting patterns or data processes or structures, et cetera. So how does this work in practice? So in practice, we kind of look at this kind of on three levels: one on the governance side, one on the process flow side, and then one on the intellectual property side. We try to keep this approach multidimensional, because if you look at most of the major industry studies around this, they really recommend this multidimensional approach. And we're really trying to apply the right processes and efficiency curve to the work. So there are times when we want to be fast, right, on the either on the open standard side or the open source side. And there are times when it pays to be a little slower and to be a little more deliberate. And really, we think that this is an opportunity for subject matter experts, kind of both from this open standard side and the open source side, to come together in a community and have their contributions work together. And those who can make intellectual property commitments are welcomed to do this, whether they're organizations or are members of OASIS or not. Now, obviously, we would love for them to come be members, but we've built a system where you can actually make contributions to the open source project or to these standards without necessarily being a member of the organization, as long as you agree to the intellectual property commitments that are part of that. So with that, we've actually come to the end of our time with about 15 minutes left. I want to close kind of by thanking all of you for this opportunity, but really to reiterate that I think that we have a lot to gain by bringing the open source and open standards communities together, and really little reason for us to keep them apart. We do recognize that as part of this, that not every open source project that comes to OASIS is necessarily going to intersect with a standard. Not every project will want to advance fully to an internationally recognized specification. They may stop at open project specification, and that may be good enough. But I think in reaching a certain level of maturity or seeking certain level of impact, most organizations are going to benefit from the standardization activities. And it's also important to note that not every standardization activity will necessarily inspire a lot of open source implementations, but at least if it's an open standard, you can have implementations that are closed or open. So with that, I think we are done with my portion, and I'd love to hear more from all of you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Guy, for that incredible, high-level, fantastic breakdown of open source and open standards. I love it. I was taking notes the whole time too, and I agree there needs to be a way that we can connect both of them, especially with everything that's going on right now. I do want to say, I know we have about 15 minutes still, so please put your questions in for Guy. He's the expert. He is here to answer anything you might have, and he's live. So this is your opportunity to ask away. I also want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded and will be emailed out to you within the next 48 hours. So with that, let's see what questions we got coming in. The first one is coming from Robert, and Robert is asking, what about cybersecurity with open source? Will this make nation states happy to have it easier to place their attack code or lace their attack code?
You know, it's interesting. The whole notion of security by obscurity is one that has been debunked quite a bit. I think that, you look at something like SolarWinds, right? Now, SolarWinds was a proprietary piece of software that was built. It used a lot of open source software, as all proprietary products do these days, use a lot of open source software. I think that the rule of being able to look at and inspect the open source software that's part of your product is really, really important. Now, just because it's available for everybody to look at doesn't necessarily mean it's always secure. There still has to be diligence that happens, but I think it's a lot easier to validate with the global open source community looking at pieces of code, right? Let's take Linux, for example, right? Bugs get found really quickly. Security bugs get found really quickly in Linux. I wouldn't say the same thing about some proprietary products. I think it's harder. You're basically relying on the vendor to do that. And I'm not saying vendors are, out to, it's in their best interest to make sure that the bugs aren't there too, but it's just a little bit easier from my perspective to look at something that's in open source and have the community validate whether there's security issues there or not. I think it's tougher for nation states to lace things into an open source product than it is to basically, take over, for example, the SolarWinds build system and insert code in there that you can't verify.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a really good point, especially with the SolarWinds. I mean, everything's constantly changing, so it's really good to have, that information and kind of strategize with that. So Robert, if you have any other follow-ups, please place them in the questions panel. We are here to help. The next question, this one is coming from Junior, and Junior is saying, how much time do you believe needs to be allocated to create this balance between the two practices of open source and open standards?
Ooh, how much time? How much time do you have? Um, I don't think it's I don't think it's something where you've got to say, okay, you need to focus 100% of time on this, or even 80% of the time. I think for me, and whether it's you find this at OASIS with our foundation, or you find it at Eclipse or Linux Foundation or somewhere else, but finding that neutral place that understands how to merge these things together, I think is really, really important, because yes, you can do it on your own. And I've seen that happen at places like Open Connectivity Foundation, right, which was Samsung and Intel. But then the OCF, when we formed it, it kind of merged off into a neutral body, because again, it's easier for a neutral body to help sort of direct that effort and figure out how many resources you need to put in place for that. Um, I think it's obviously you can't say, oh, like I said, 100% focus on this, but it definitely needs to be in the conversation. And I think that's where I find the challenge today, is that I don't think it's always in the conversation, because usually what I have found is that you've got either the open source community or the open standards community kind of looking again in an adversarial role at the other group and saying, well, you're slowing us down, and the standards people saying, well, you're going too fast and you're not considering all the use cases. So I think where I would spend most of my effort, if it were me, is in, again, finding that common ground between the two communities, making sure that they understand that, again, while they have different perspectives of how to get things done, they're searching for those same common goals of innovation, choice, and interoperability.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that answer, we have Bernardo coming in here asking, how is the financial institution, how are financial institutions approaching open source?
Well, it's interesting. There's a whole FinCom foundation that was just spun up, and I think it's interesting because, and again, a great example of a highly regulated procurement pipeline that in the past has probably traditionally been focused more on standards. But I think the reality is that, especially with blockchain, right? Take that as an example. Things like the work that's going on in the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, who we have a very good relationship with at OASIS. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, Banco Santander in Spain is doing a lot of work in blockchain and a lot of work in open source. So I think, and I did some work with financial institutions earlier in my career. I think they're cautious, right? And they should be cautious. It's kind of that's their role to be cautious, but there's not a single place or industry that I've seen that has said, yeah, we're not going to do open source. We can't do open source. We're kind of well past that point now. So are they as all in necessarily as other industries? Maybe, maybe not. But I think, the fact that there's now a whole FinCom foundation stood up to work on open source things is a pretty good indicator that they recognize that, anything that has to do with cloud is all based on open source things. So you kind of can't get away from it. You need to be able to embrace it.
Absolutely. The cloud is such a really good point. That could be a whole other webinar seminar on that as well. I'm really glad that you brought that up. And with that answer, actually, we have Mohsen who's popping in a question. And Mohsen is asking, I'm new to open source and I have some ideas to start an open source product and defining some standards around them. Where should I start from? How do I gather the community? And what are some learning resources?
Well, we're happy to have a conversation with you, even if you don't end up hosting with us, but just kind of a conversation around what it looks like to be able to start those kinds of things. So, but I think most of you made a really great point about finding the community. And that's kind of a point I'd like to talk about because in one of my previous incarnations in my career, I ran strategic open source consulting for Red Hat. And one of the things that I think we repeatedly found is that organizations that just say, hey, we're going to start an open source project and we're just going to throw code out there, it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Because it's not a field of dreams, analogy with where if we build it, they will come. I mean, maybe if you're AWS, right, and you've got a lot of pull, or Google and you have a lot of pull, maybe that works. But finding the community, going out and understanding, hey, where are the likely companies, or maybe even partners or competitors that are likely to need this technology. So we're sort of doing that legwork ahead of time to understand who's going to comprise that community, rather than just expecting that community to form organically, is really, really important. So I would think, start by understanding who you think is going to be part of your community, and figure out kind of what that community is comprised of. Is it mostly open source people? Is it mostly open standards people? Is there a combination of the two? And then like I said, happy to have a conversation. Again, that doesn't mean you necessarily come host it with us, but happy to have a conversation to give you maybe the benefit of some of the expertise we've hard-earned lessons we've sort of gotten at this point.
Absolutely, most. And then I believe to reach out to Guy, you can do it on LinkedIn, open source, and then also the email that he had posted. We'll also be sending out the slides, so you can reach out to him at any time for more information. But he is your guy, he is the expert. He really is. And we have a lot of other questions coming in as well. The next question, this one is coming from Melissa, and Melissa's asking, how has the pandemic accelerated or decelerated enterprise open source?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily done either. And I know that may be a controversial viewpoint, but I think that open source has won for the most part, right? Desktops aside, setting desktops aside for the second. I mean, there's not a single piece of technology from, this ring that I wear that tracks my sleep, to the watch that I have, to my phone, to this computer, that does not at some level, cars, have open source in it. So I think that that has continued with what's gone on in the pandemic, right? I think there's more of a reliance on technology. There's probably a slight, if I had to guess, I'd say there's a slight bump maybe in more folks going, hey, to satisfy the demand that has happened with, again, schooling at home, shopping at home, et cetera. Maybe there's been a little bit of bump in open source from that, but I don't think it's been, all of a sudden where we had the pandemic and everybody said, oh, we got to jump on open source, or we've got to jump on standards. I think it's just been kind of more, more of the same in terms of the fact that open source is so prevalent in everything that we touch, that we're at a point where we're long past the point where I've had to ever talk to a CTO or somebody that says, well, no, we don't want to use open source, or we're not using open source, or we're never going to use open source. You just can't avoid it, right? Again, we use the example of cloud. Is there any CTO out there that's like, well, we're not thinking about cloud, whether it's hybrid, or whether it's fully cloud native? There's not a single business out there that I don't think has said, yeah, we're not interested in cloud, or figuring out what we're going to do with that. And again, once you've gone to something like cloud, you're touching open source. There's no way to avoid it. So I would say that I don't necessarily think that it's been a huge increase. Definitely not been a decrease. Let's get that out of the way. But I don't know if it's been a huge increase. I think it's been more of the same. But it's just, we're relying on these technologies more and more. So I think it's becoming more of a central thing to the front of people's minds, as opposed to a huge ramp up in interactions.
Absolutely, that's a really great point. Just kind of moving its placement of priority where it's at. Yeah, because you're right. I haven't seen a decelerating either, but I haven't seen like a rampant amount. So I think it's at a nice spot where people, like everyone on here today, are interested in learning more about it, and then from there we can kind of figure out like the weaknesses and build a conversation, right? The conversation between open source and open standards, which is very needed. Definitely very needed. So we have time for one more question, and this question's from me, and I love to ask my speakers this. What do you think is the next frontier of open source and open standards? Where do you see it going in the next 5 years or so?
Well, again, I think I used the analogy of Back to the Future, right? If I had my druthers, and this is not just obviously because I work at OASIS, but again, I think it's the reason I came to OASIS is because I do see this huge ability and this huge market potential to go back to the kind of relationship that standards and open source had at the beginning of the internet, right? Figuring out a way to say that all of the things we need to do, whether again it's in security, whether it's in emergency management or medical response. I would love to see us be able to have that really close relationship that allows open source and open standards to make things easier, right? I mean, at the end of the day, why do we build technology? Why am I in technology? Why have I always loved being in this field, both from when I wrote code for a living to now when I, lead organizations? It's because technology properly applied, and I think open source and open standards properly applied is the engine that can move us forward as a society. Now we've got to do that, with an eye on the full gamut of, kind of societal needs and ethics and all of the other things. That it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but I think getting back to that very close relationship that we saw at the beginning of the internet, I think is going to be the thing that pushes our economic engine forward. It's going to be the thing that hopefully makes us more prepared for things that we have to deal with as a society going forward.
Absolutely. Like you said, back to the future, back to basics. That was a really great answer. And I liked how it kind of synthesized everything that we were talking about today. All right, guys. Well, it's exactly 12 noon. I just want to say for everyone that's listening with us today, thank you so very much for your time. Also, thank you to our incredible sponsor, Instaclustr, who is also available for additional resources and whatnot. So definitely check them out. And of course, last but not least, our incredible speaker, Guy Martin. Thank you so much for your time, for your wonderful insights, and for helping everyone here in the open source community kind of understand a better way to bridge open source and open standards. So really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, everybody. Appreciate it.